It took 7 months and 4 separate neurology consultations to trace a sudden, total loss of consciousness back to 3 inches of starched cotton. The physical distance between the brain and the neck is short, but the diagnostic path from a severe blackout to a completely ordinary piece of formalwear proved remarkably vast. This is one of 3 clinical histories examined here, where the distance between a patient's suffering and its source requires careful, methodical unwinding. The cases move through a profound physical exhaustion, an unquiet pulse, and those sudden fainting spells, mapping the quiet and sometimes strange mechanics of human physiology. As these investigations unfold, you do not need to track every symptom or stay awake for the final diagnosis. It is perfectly fine to let the clinical details blur, detaching from the narrative to just drift away. There are no sudden alarms here, and nothing in these files will startle you, allowing you to leave the mystery behind whenever you are ready to sleep. The black drop. The decline began with a profound, unhurried exhaustion. Over the course of several weeks, the patient noticed a growing heaviness in their limbs. Walking up a single flight of stairs felt like wading through deep water. Soon the ankles began to swell, the skin tight and faintly shiny from fluid gathering in the tissues below. Then came the fluttering. Deep within the chest, the heart would occasionally stumble, beating with a rapid, uneven cadence. It felt less like pain and more like a gentle, irregular knocking against the inside of the ribs. This quiet progression culminated one evening in the kitchen. Without any sudden pain or distress, the room simply dimmed. The patient lost consciousness, waking a moment later on the floor, confused but otherwise unhurt. At the hospital, the initial examination painted a familiar, cohesive picture. The patient's blood pressure was significantly elevated. The pulse beneath the doctor's fingers was strong but erratic, pausing unpredictably before resuming its rhythm. A faint indentation remained when the doctor pressed gently on the skin of the lower legs, confirming that water was indeed being retained in the extremities. An electrocardiogram, a simple test that maps the electrical signals traveling through the heart, provided more detail. The heart relies on a highly coordinated electrical grid to tell the muscle fibers exactly when to squeeze and when to relax. After every single heartbeat, the muscle cells must carefully recharge, shifting mineral salts across their outer walls to ready themselves for the next signal. The paper printout showed that this grid was misfiring. The electrical waves were stretched out, indicating that the heart was taking far too long to reset between beats. This delay was occasionally triggering an extra premature squeeze, throwing off the entire rhythm. Based on this evidence, the medical team arrived at a very reasonable first conclusion. They suspected a failing heart muscle, likely driven by long-standing high blood pressure. When the vessels of the body are tight and constricted, the heart must pump much harder to push blood forward. Over time, this constant physical strain can cause the heart muscle to thicken and stiffen. A stiff heart struggles to relax and fill properly, causing blood and fluid to back up into the legs. Furthermore, a strained, overworked heart muscle often develops electrical instability, leading to the exact kind of irregular rhythm and sudden fainting the patient had experienced. It was a classic presentation of structural heart disease. The timeline, the physical examination, and the electrical tracing all pointed in the same direction. The doctors began to outline a standard approach to help the heart rest and to gently clear the excess fluid from the body. To confirm the diagnosis and measure the extent of the strain, the team ordered an ultrasound of the heart. They expected to see a thickened, tired muscle struggling to keep up with the demands of the body. Instead, the images moving quietly across the screen showed something entirely different. The walls of the heart were perfectly normal in size, the muscle squeezed with excellent, vigorous force. The valves opened and closed with crisp precision. There was no structural damage, no thickening, and no sign of chronic strain. The pump itself was fundamentally healthy, even as its internal rhythm remained inexplicably disrupted. With the heart muscle itself absolved of blame, the medical team had to widen their view. If the pump was structurally sound, the electrical misfires and the fluid backing up into the patient's legs had to be symptoms of a systemic problem. The doctors turned their attention away from the heart's anatomy and looked instead to the blood that flowed through it, waiting for the results of the routine laboratory tests they had drawn upon the patient's arrival. When the numbers finally populated on the screen, one value immediately stood out. The level of potassium in the blood was dangerously low. Potassium is a simple mineral found abundantly in the earth and in much of the food we eat, but it carries a tiny electrical charge. The heart relies on a precise balance of these charged particles, moving in and out of the heart cells, to generate the electricity that tells the muscle to squeeze. If calcium and sodium are the sparks that initiate the contraction, potassium is the reset button. After every single beat, potassium rushes out of the heart cells to restore the electrical baseline, preparing the muscle for the next impulse. When potassium levels in the blood drop too low, this delicate resetting process takes longer than it should. The heart's internal electrical grid becomes unstable. Extra, early, or uncoordinated beats can slip in, disrupting the steady rhythm. In severe cases, this electrical chaos prevents the heart from effectively pumping blood to the brain, explaining why the patient had suddenly fainted. The fainting was not a failure of the heart muscle, but a localized power failure brought on by a lack of potassium. The doctors now knew what was causing the irregular heartbeat, but this only traded one mystery for another. The human body is remarkably adept at holding onto the minerals it needs. To lose this much potassium, something had to be actively driving it out of the system. The investigation shifted from the heart to the kidneys, the primary organs responsible for managing the body's water and mineral supply. The kidneys function as a sophisticated filtration plant. As blood passes through them, they decide what to keep and what to send out of the body as urine. One of their most important jobs is balancing sodium, which holds onto water, and potassium. To make these decisions, the kidney relies on chemical messengers, or hormones. When the body needs to raise blood pressure or hold onto water, it releases a specific hormone that travels to the kidneys. This hormone finds its way to specialized receiving stations, or receptors, on the outside of the kidney cells. Like a key sliding into a lock, the hormone attaches to the receptor and turns on microscopic machinery inside the cell. This machinery operates a strict exchange program. For every particle of sodium the kidney pulls back into the blood, it must throw one particle of potassium out into the urine. Under normal circumstances, this exchange is carefully rationed. But biological systems often contain curious overlaps. The receptor in the kidney that responds to the salt-saving hormone is not entirely exclusive. There is another hormone in the body, cortisol, which usually manages stress and energy. Cortisol happens to share a very similar molecular shape to the salt-saving hormone. Its shape is so similar that cortisol can fit perfectly into the exact same receptor in the kidneys. This creates a potential vulnerability. The human body produces cortisol in amounts that are vastly larger than the salt-saving hormone. If all that cortisol were allowed to interact with the kidney's receptors, it would constantly signal the kidneys to hold onto sodium and dump potassium. The exchange machinery would run out of control. To protect against this, the kidney cells employ a brilliant defensive mechanism. They produce a specialized enzyme that acts as a microscopic security guard, stationed right next to the receptors. As cortisol approaches, this enzyme quickly intercepts it, altering its chemical structure just enough to render it inactive. The altered cortisol can no longer fit into the lock. Because of this tireless enzyme, the heavy flow of cortisol passes harmlessly, keeping the kidney responsive only to the correct signals. Understanding this delicate balance allowed the doctors to piece together the mechanics of the patient's illness. The protective enzyme in the kidneys had somehow been disabled. Without the security guard in place, the kidneys were suddenly exposed to the full, overwhelming force of the body's natural cortisol. The receptors were flooded. The kidney cells received a continuous, blaring chemical signal to activate the exchange program. Day after day, the microscopic pumps worked relentlessly, pulling sodium out of the urine and pushing it back into the bloodstream. As the sodium built up in the blood, it drew water along with it, expanding the total volume of fluid in the circulatory system. This excess fluid increased the pressure in the blood vessels and slowly seeped out into the surrounding tissues, causing the heavy, swollen legs the patient had noticed weeks earlier. At the exact same time, the other half of the exchange program was quietly draining the body's potassium stores. For every extra molecule of sodium pulled in, a molecule of potassium was pushed out into the urine and washed away. Over time, the potassium levels in the blood drifted lower and lower, until the heart's electrical grid finally began to stutter. The entire cascade of symptoms, from the fluid retention to the fainting, stemmed from the failure of a single enzyme in the kidneys. But this enzyme does not simply stop working on its own. Genetic conditions that disable it are exceedingly rare and typically identified in childhood, whereas this patient had been perfectly healthy until recently. The medical team knew that something from the outside world must have been introduced into the patient's system. They needed to find a chemical compound capable of traveling through the blood, entering the kidneys, and shutting down that specific protective enzyme. The answer would not be found in another blood test or imaging scan, but in a quiet, careful conversation about the small routines of the patient's daily life. The medical team sat down with the patient to review everything consumed in a typical day, extending far beyond prescribed medications. They discussed meals, snacks, favorite beverages, and over-the-counter supplements. The questioning was gentle and methodical, moving hour by hour through an average week to build a complete picture of the patient's dietary habits. When the conversation turned to sweets, the patient mentioned a lifelong fondness for a very specific type of candy, consumed by the handful every evening while reading or watching television. It was traditional European-style black licorice. This single detail, offered almost as an afterthought, was the missing puzzle piece. The diagnosis was glycyrrhizin-induced hypokalemia, a condition where a natural botanical compound drives the blood potassium down to dangerously low levels. Real black licorice is flavored with an extract derived from the root of the licorice plant. This root contains a remarkably sweet chemical called glycyrrhizin. When digested and absorbed into the bloodstream, this chemical travels to the kidneys and perfectly jams the machinery of that single, vital protective enzyme. Without the enzyme standing guard, the body's natural stress hormone, cortisol, floods the delicate salt-handling tubes of the kidney. Because cortisol is structurally similar to the hormones that regulate hydration, the kidney cells mistake its presence for a sudden, urgent signal to hoard salt and water, while simultaneously flushing away potassium. It is an ancient botanical defense, effectively turning a common candy into a highly specific chemical inhibitor. The patient had been eating enough of this extract, day after day, to completely overwhelm the kidney's ability to maintain a safe electrical balance for the heart. Once the chemical mechanism was identified, the treatment was remarkably straightforward and required no complex medical interventions. The first and most essential step was for the patient to simply stop eating black licorice. This allowed the blocked enzyme in the kidneys to gradually clear away the glycyrrhizin and resume its normal protective work of filtering out the excess cortisol. To address the immediate danger, the medical team carefully replenished the depleted potassium stores. Over the course of a few days in the quiet environment of the hospital, the patient received steady, diluted infusions of potassium, administered slowly through an intravenous line to avoid shocking the system. As the mineral levels gently rose in the blood, the heart's electrical grid found its footing again. The stuttering rhythm smoothed out into a regular, steady beat, and the dizzy spells faded away. Within a week, the kidneys began to function normally, finding their natural balance. The excess sodium and water that had pooled in the patient's legs were efficiently filtered out, reducing the heavy swelling and restoring a comfortable, ordinary appearance. The blood pressure, which had been driven artificially high by the retained salt, drifted quietly back down to a healthy range. The patient was eventually able to return home, feeling completely recovered and equipped with a new understanding of how seemingly harmless plant extracts can interact with the body's deeply hidden chemistry. A follow-up visit a month later confirmed that the heart remained perfectly stable. This resolution highlights a quiet truth about the daily practice of medicine. While modern hospitals are equipped with remarkably advanced imaging machines and complex genetic tests, the final step in solving a difficult case often rests on simple human communication. The intricate biochemical pathways of the body do not exist in isolation, but are constantly reacting to the ordinary choices we make in our waking lives. Diagnosis, at its core, is the careful art of translating between these two very different worlds, ultimately connecting a life-threatening fluctuation in a microscopic electrolyte to a handful of candy eaten in the quiet hours of the evening. The stiff collar. The patient arrived at the neurology clinic, seeking an explanation for a series of sudden, unexplained blackouts. He was a man in his early 60s, generally in excellent health. He walked 2 miles a day, maintained a healthy diet, and took no regular daily medications. The episodes had begun a few months prior, arriving entirely without warning. There was no preceding dizziness, no racing heart, and no shortness of breath. He would simply experience a sudden dimming of his peripheral vision, a quiet sensation of the room fading to gray, and then he would lose consciousness completely, collapsing to the ground. Within a minute or two, he would wake up feeling perfectly alert and entirely himself, aside from the soreness caused by the sudden fall. These fainting spells, known medically as syncope, did not appear to be tied to physical exertion. They never happened while he was out for his daily walk or carrying heavy groceries. Instead, they occurred during ordinary, seemingly uneventful moments. The initial physical examination found nothing out of the ordinary. His resting heart rate was steady, like a quiet metronome. His blood pressure was perfectly normal, remaining stable whether he was lying flat on the examination table or standing upright. Listening to his chest with a stethoscope revealed clear, expansive lungs, and the rhythmic, reassuring sound of healthy heart valves smoothly opening and closing. A standard neurological check showed normal reflexes, steady balance, and no signs of muscle weakness anywhere in his body. On paper, there was no obvious cause for concern. Given his age and the sheer suddenness of the falls, the initial medical thinking naturally gravitated toward a problem located within the brain itself. The two most common explanations for this kind of abrupt loss of awareness are adult-onset epilepsy or a temporary disruption of blood flow, often called a transient ischemic attack or mini-stroke. A mini-stroke happens when a microscopic blood clot temporarily drifts into and blocks one of the small vessels supplying the brain. This deprives the local tissue of oxygen just long enough to cause a loss of function before the clot dissolves and normal blood flow resumes, leaving no permanent damage. Epilepsy, similarly, can cause brief pauses in consciousness. It involves a sudden, disorganized wave of electrical activity among the brain cells, which temporarily overwhelms normal communication. Both diagnoses were entirely reasonable starting points. They neatly explained the unpredictable nature of the blackouts and the fact that the patient remained seemingly perfectly healthy in the days and weeks between the events. However, as the clinical history was carefully reviewed again, a few quiet details began to gently resist these initial theories. When a person experiences an epileptic seizure, the brain requires time to reset. They typically wake up feeling deeply fatigued and disoriented, a recovery period that can last for several hours. This patient woke up with a perfectly clear head every single time. Furthermore, a mini-stroke usually causes highly specific symptoms that depend on exactly which tiny blood vessel is blocked. It tends to produce weakness in one arm, a subtle drooping on one side of the face, or a sudden difficulty finding the right words. A pure total blackout is rarely the only sign. There was also a subtle, curious pattern to the timing of the events. They never once occurred on the weekends, when he wore relaxed clothing around the house. They seemed to happen exclusively on weekday mornings, usually just as he was finishing preparing for work. The pattern of these weekday morning events eventually pointed toward a very specific physical ritual. Preparing for his formal office environment involved dressing in a crisp, well-pressed shirt with a stiff collar and drawing a necktie tightly up to the throat. To understand why this seemingly harmless action could lead to a sudden and profound loss of consciousness, it is helpful to look closely at the remarkable physiological engineering that keeps blood flowing steadily to the human brain. The brain is a demanding organ. It holds essentially no energy reserves of its own, meaning it relies entirely on a continuous, uninterrupted delivery of oxygen and microscopic sugars from the bloodstream. Furthermore, because humans walk upright, the brain sits at the very top of the body. Every time a person stands up out of a chair, gravity naturally attempts to pull their blood downward, away from the head and toward the legs. Without an active, responsive system to constantly monitor and adjust for this gravitational pull, merely standing up would cause the average person to faint. The body solves this complex plumbing problem with an elegant, invisible network of sensors. The main pathways delivering fresh, oxygen-rich blood up to the brain are the carotid arteries. These are the thick, pulsing blood vessels that can easily be felt beneath the skin on either side of the windpipe in the front of the neck. Just before these large arteries enter the bony vault of the skull, they widen slightly into a small bulb. Hidden deep within the flexible walls of this swelling is a microscopic array of highly specialized nerve endings. These are pressure sensors, working tirelessly around the clock to measure the exact force of the blood pushing against the artery walls from the inside. They function very much like internal stretch detectors. When the heart contracts and beats with force, blood pressure rises, and the artery wall balloons outward very slightly. The tiny, delicate sensors feel this stretching and instantly fire a cascade of electrical impulses up a dedicated nerve pathway, straight into the base of the brainstem. The base of the brain receives this rhythmic stream of signals and interprets them as a live reading of the body's current blood pressure. If the pressure is getting too high, the artery stretches further, and the sensors send a rapid, intense burst of signals. The brain responds by sending a calming message down a different pathway, a long, wandering bundle of fibers known as the vagus nerve, which connects directly to the heart muscle. This message acts like a gentle brake pedal, instructing the heart to slow its rhythm and telling the blood vessels throughout the body to relax and widen. As the heart slows and the circulatory pipes open up, the pressure drops back down to a safe level. Conversely, if a person stands up quickly and the internal pressure drops, the artery walls relax, the sensors fall quiet, and the brain instantly releases the brake, allowing the heart to speed up and pump harder to push blood back up against gravity. This continuous balancing conversation happens with every heartbeat, entirely below the level of conscious thought. In a perfectly healthy circulatory system, these microscopic sensors in the neck are finely calibrated to respond only to the internal pressure of the blood flowing past them. However, as the human body ages, the structural tissues of the blood vessels can slowly lose some of their natural elasticity and suppleness. They become slightly thicker and stiffer. In some individuals, for reasons that are not entirely understood, this subtle stiffening of the artery walls causes the pressure sensors nestled within them to become exquisitely oversensitive. They lose their precise internal calibration. Instead of merely measuring the steady, rhythmic pulse of blood from the inside, they become hyperreactive to the slightest mechanical touch or pressure coming from the outside. This slow, quiet shift in sensitivity was the hidden vulnerability in the patient's morning routine. As he stood before the mirror each weekday and cinched his necktie tight beneath a heavily starched shirt collar, the unyielding fabric pressed directly against the side of his neck. This firm external pressure pushed inward on the exact spot where the oversensitive stretch receptors lay waiting just beneath the skin. The delicate nerve endings could not distinguish between pressure pushing out from the inside of the artery and pressure pushing in from the outside world. When the tight collar pressed against the artery, the sensors registered a sudden, massive deformation of the vessel wall. They interpreted this harmless external pressure as a life-threatening, catastrophic spike in internal blood pressure. Functioning exactly as they were designed to do during a genuine circulatory crisis, the hypersensitive sensors fired a frantic, overwhelming alarm signal up to the brainstem. The brain, receiving this urgent warning of dangerously high pressure, reacted with immediate and profound force. It slammed the physiological brake pedal completely to the floor. Through the vagus nerve, a powerful signal was sent downward, instructing the heart to slow drastically. In severe cases of this condition, the braking signal is so strong that the heart will actually pause completely, missing several beats in a row. At the exact same moment, the blood vessels in the legs were given the emergency order to open as wide as possible to relieve the imagined pressure. With the heart abruptly pausing and the blood vessels opening wide, the patient's actual blood pressure plummeted instantly. The vital, steady flow of oxygen up to the brain simply stopped. Deprived of its essential fuel supply, the brain gracefully shut down conscious awareness to protect itself, causing the patient to experience a sudden, total blackout and collapse to the floor. The pure elegance of this physical mechanism also perfectly explained his rapid and clean recoveries. Once he fell flat on the ground, two crucial things happened. First, gravity was no longer fighting the flow of blood to the head. Second, the angle of his neck naturally changed as he fell, shifting his clothing and releasing the tight, pinching grip of the stiff collar. The external pressure was removed, the sensors stopped firing their false alarm, the vagus nerve lifted the brake, and the heart immediately resumed its normal rhythm. Blood rushed back to the brain, and the patient woke up a few moments later, feeling perfectly clear-headed and entirely unaware of the invisible, mechanical drama that had just unfolded inside his neck. This specific phenomenon is known in medicine as carotid sinus hypersensitivity. The carotid sinus is the small, naturally widened area in the main artery of the neck where these microscopic pressure sensors are concentrated. Hypersensitivity simply means that these tiny sensors are far more reactive to physical touch than they should be. In a typical person, a tightly fastened shirt collar or a securely knotted tie might cause a sense of mild irritation, but the internal sensors will largely ignore the external squeeze. In this patient, however, the threshold for triggering that massive, system-wide braking reflex was unusually low, meaning even the everyday pressure of formal clothing was enough to convince his nervous system that a blood pressure crisis was underway. The final clue that pointed the medical team to this precise diagnosis did not come from a complex brain scan, an overnight sleep study, or an advanced blood test. Instead, it emerged from a slow, methodical review of the exact, seemingly mundane circumstances surrounding each of his blackouts. The doctors began to notice a subtle but undeniable pattern in the events. The patient had collapsed while turning his head sharply to look over his shoulder while parallel parking a car. Another episode occurred while he was looking up toward a high shelf, wearing a formal work shirt. A third blackout happened precisely at the moment he was pulling a necktie taut in the morning mirror. It was this careful focus on his physical environment and the specific movements of his neck that shifted the entire investigation away from internal diseases of the brain or structural defects of the heart. To confirm their suspicions safely, the doctors performed a very controlled test in the clinic, known as a carotid sinus massage. While the patient was lying down comfortably and connected to a continuous monitor to watch his heart rhythm, a physician applied gentle, deliberate pressure with their fingers to the side of his neck, right over the location of the carotid sinus. Within a few seconds, the rhythmic line on the monitor slowed down significantly. His heart rate dropped and his blood pressure began to fade, safely mimicking the exact start of one of his frightening episodes. The physician immediately released the gentle pressure, the vital signs swiftly returned to normal, and the long-standing mystery was definitively solved. The treatment for this condition, especially after months of profound worry about strokes or progressive neurological decline, was remarkably simple. Because the patient's heart and brain were fundamentally healthy and capable, there was no need for daily medications or complex medical routines. The primary intervention was a deliberate, permanent change in his wardrobe. He was instructed to wear soft shirts with collars that were at least 1/2 size larger than his true neck measurement. He avoided stiff, heavily starched fabrics entirely, and when professional settings required a tie, he left the top button of his shirt open, keeping the knot resting loosely against his collarbone rather than his throat. For some individuals with highly unpredictable or severe cases of carotid sinus hypersensitivity, doctors might gently implant a small cardiac pacemaker under the skin, which silently watches the heart and steps in to maintain a steady beat if the nervous system ever tries to pause it. However, for this patient, simply removing the mechanical trigger was entirely sufficient. By giving his neck just a gentle fraction of an inch of physical breathing room, the false alarms ceased completely, and he returned to his life entirely free from the sudden blackouts. The arc of this patient's journey offers a quiet reminder of how medical diagnosis actually functions in practice. When faced with dramatic and terrifying symptoms, there is a natural tendency to search for equally dramatic, complex diseases hidden deep within the body's tissues. Yet the answer frequently lies in the simple, everyday interactions between a person's physical environment and their delicate nervous system. The most powerful diagnostic tool remains the careful mapping of the patient's own daily experiences, demonstrating that patient, attentive listening is often far more illuminating than the most advanced technology. The butcher's pulse. The patient arrived at the outpatient clinic early on a weekday morning, looking profoundly exhausted but unable to sit still. The symptoms had started to build gradually over the previous 2 days. It began with a persistent, uncomfortable warmth. Even though the weather outside was quite cool, the patient had been opening windows and using a fan, feeling constantly flushed. Soon after, the heart began to race. It was a heavy, bounding sensation in the chest, beating with a rapid rhythm that made it impossible to relax. It felt as though an internal engine had been shifted into a high gear, and the body was running a marathon while sitting quietly in a chair. At night, this meant sleep was entirely out of reach. The patient lay awake for 48 hours, feeling a restless energy and a fine, persistent trembling in the hands that made holding a glass of water difficult. When the physician walked into the exam room, the physical signs were visibly apparent. The examination confirmed exactly what the patient was describing. The skin was unusually warm to the touch and damp with a thin layer of sweat. The physician wrapped a cuff around the patient's arm to measure blood pressure and placed a stethoscope over the chest to listen to the heart. The resting heart rate was remarkably high, hovering around 140 beats per minute. A typical adult resting heart rate generally stays between 60 and 100 beats per minute, ticking away smoothly in the background. This heart was sprinting. The blood pressure was also high, particularly the top number, which represents the sheer force of the blood being pushed out of the heart with each contraction. Based on this initial presentation, the most obvious and logical diagnosis was a severe panic attack, perhaps compounded by a mild viral infection. This was a highly reasonable conclusion drawn from the physical evidence. When a person experiences a surge of extreme anxiety, the brain activates a network of nerves designed to prepare the body for sudden action. This system floods the bloodstream with chemical messengers like adrenaline. Adrenaline acts as a master switch for physical exertion. It commands the heart to beat faster to supply muscles with oxygen-rich blood. It activates the sweat glands to cool the body down in preparation for a sudden sprint. It also keeps the mind sharply alert, which naturally prevents sleep and causes a nervous tremor in the limbs. If not a stress response, a common virus was the next best guess. A viral infection often causes a mild fever, and the body naturally increases the heart rate to help circulate defensive immune cells more rapidly. Either explanation seamlessly accounted for the flushed skin, the fast pulse, and the exhaustion. The physician ordered a standard set of blood tests, provided fluids, and asked the patient to rest in a quiet, dimly lit observation room to allow the suspected adrenaline surge to fade. Exhausted by days of wakefulness, the patient eventually drifted into a light sleep. However, the nurse checking the vital signs an hour later noted something unusual. Even in a state of quiet, unconscious rest, with no anxious thoughts to trigger an alarm response, the patient's heart rate remained stubbornly locked at 140 beats per minute. The realization that the patient's heart was racing during sleep changed the trajectory of the medical investigation entirely. Adrenaline is a reactive chemical released in response to a specific trigger. It clears the bloodstream in a matter of minutes once the perceived physical or emotional threat has passed. For a heart to hammer at more than twice its normal resting rate in the absence of any conscious distress or physical movement, the problem had to be rooted deeper in the body's fundamental operating system. The physicians turned their attention from the fleeting signals of the nervous system to the slower, more enduring realm of the endocrine system. This is the network of glands that sets the body's long-term internal rhythms. They began to consider the body's primary metabolic thermostat, the thyroid gland. Located at the base of the neck, shaped somewhat like a small butterfly resting lightly against the windpipe, this organ is responsible for setting the fundamental pace of human life. While a surge of adrenaline acts like the sudden depression of an accelerator pedal, the hormones produced by the thyroid gland act more like an engine's permanent idle setting. They determine how much fuel the body burns, how much heat it generates, and how fast the internal machinery runs when a person is doing absolutely nothing at all. This gland draws microscopic amounts of iodine from the bloodstream, which is largely absorbed from the food a person eats, and uses it to manufacture specialized chemical messengers known as thyroid hormones. These messengers are then released into the blood in a steady, carefully measured trickle. Unlike many other signals in the body that only affect specific organs, thyroid hormones have a universal pass. They are welcomed by almost every single cell in the human body. Once inside a cell, the messenger travels directly to the center, deep into the nucleus where the genetic blueprints are kept. It interacts with the DNA itself, prompting the cell to increase its baseline level of activity. It changes how the cell reads its own instructions. One of the primary ways it does this is by commanding the cell to build more microscopic pumps along its outer membrane. These tiny pumps are constantly at work, moving dissolved salt particles in and out of the cell, a continuous process necessary for maintaining electrical balance and structural volume. Running these countless tiny pumps requires a vast amount of cellular energy. To meet the new demand, the thyroid hormone also instructs the cell's internal power plants to expand and multiply. These microscopic power plants pull in glucose and oxygen from the blood, burning them to create usable chemical energy. The natural byproduct of all this microscopic industry is warmth. When the circulating hormones increase the number of salt pumps and power plants, the cell burns more fuel and produces more heat. Across the trillions of cells in the human body, this collective burning of energy is exactly how we maintain our warm core temperature, even in a cold room. Beyond managing fuel and heat, these same chemical messengers also dictate how the body listens to its own nervous system. In the muscle tissue of the heart, thyroid hormones instruct the cells to build specific receiving structures on their outer surfaces. These structures are designed like customized locks, waiting to catch circulating molecules of adrenaline. In a healthy state, there is a perfect, measured balance. The heart has just enough receptors to respond appropriately when a person stands up, climbs a flight of stairs, or needs to react quickly. The baseline tempo is securely set, and the heart hums along steadily, accelerating only when the nervous system asks it to. Because these hormones wield such immense power over the body's resources, their production is monitored with exquisite precision. Deep inside the brain sits a tiny sensory structure that constantly tastes the blood flowing past it, sampling the concentration of the metabolic messengers. If the level drops too low, the brain releases a prompting signal that travels down to the thyroid gland, telling it to work harder. If the level rises even slightly above the ideal range, the brain immediately halts its prompting signal. Without the persistent signal from the brain, the thyroid gland simply goes dormant. It ceases all production until the excess hormones are naturally cleared from the blood by the liver and kidneys. It is an elegant, self-correcting loop, much like a household thermostat that turns off the furnace the moment a living room reaches a comfortable warmth. When the results of the patient's specialized blood tests returned from the laboratory, they revealed a system that had entirely lost this elegant balance. The blood told a story of profound chemical confusion. The brain's prompting signal was completely absent. It had dropped to undetectable levels, indicating that the brain's thermostat was frantically trying to shut down the furnace. Yet the level of thyroid hormones circulating in the blood was remarkably high, far beyond anything the body would ever naturally maintain. The patient's cells were completely inundated with these messengers. Following their chemical instructions without question, the cells across the patient's body had dutifully constructed millions of extra salt pumps and expanded their power plants to the maximum capacity. The cellular engines were trapped at their absolute highest idle speed, burning through the body's energy stores and flooding the tissues with excess heat. The sweat glands worked continuously to dissipate the warmth of this internal furnace, leading to the flushed skin and the constant, damp perspiration that the patient could not control. In the chest, the heart muscle had followed the exact same overwhelming chemical orders. The cells had built an immense, abnormal excess of receiving structures for adrenaline. With so many receptors lining the cell walls, the heart had become incredibly sensitive to the normal, quiet background whispers of the nervous system. Even the minuscule baseline amounts of adrenaline present during deep sleep were caught and amplified by the sheer number of receptors. A physiological whisper was perceived as a physiological shout. The heart responded by racing continuously, unable to slow down because its very architecture had been physically altered by the flood of hormones. This state of severe metabolic overdrive perfectly explained the exhaustion, the heat, the tremors, and the relentless pulse. The physicians understood the mechanism of the suffering clearly. The patient was enduring a toxic excess of metabolic hormone. However, the blood tests presented a profound contradiction that temporarily stalled the investigation. The brain had correctly sensed the excess and had effectively turned off the native gland in the neck. The body's own manufacturing center was completely dormant. It was not producing the flood of hormones currently ravaging the patient's system. This meant the overwhelming concentration of chemical messengers had to be entering the bloodstream from an external source. The patient was somehow absorbing massive quantities of the hormone from the outside environment. The medical team now faced an entirely different kind of puzzle. They needed to trace the ordinary daily habits of the patient to understand how such a potent, specialized biological substance could have been unknowingly ingested in quantities large enough to hijack the fundamental rhythm of the human heart. The medical team began a meticulous review of everything the patient consumed, searching for a hidden source of the hormone. They started with the most common culprits, asking quietly about weight loss supplements, energy pills, and muscle-building powders, which occasionally contain undeclared animal glandular tissue. The patient took none of these. They lived a routine life, drinking mostly water and eating standard, home-cooked meals. The investigation might have stalled there, but health officials soon noticed a quiet pattern. A small cluster of other individuals in the surrounding community had begun visiting local clinics with the exact same constellation of symptoms: a racing pulse, unyielding heat, and wide-awake exhaustion. When investigators mapped the daily habits of these affected individuals, a single overlapping detail emerged. They all purchased their ground beef from the same local supplier. This realization led to a diagnosis that is exceptionally rare in modern medicine: a condition known as hamburger thyrotoxicosis. To understand how an ordinary dinner could trigger a metabolic crisis, one must look at the anatomy of cattle and the mechanics of meat processing. In cows, just as in humans, the thyroid gland sits in the front of the neck, nestled against the windpipe. When butchers process beef from the neck region, an area often used to make ground meat, they must carefully trim away the surrounding tissues. If this process is imprecise, small pieces of the cow's thyroid gland can be inadvertently ground up along with the muscle. A cow's thyroid gland produces metabolic hormones that are structurally identical to human thyroid hormones. Furthermore, these particular chemical messengers are incredibly robust. While most proteins in meat unravel and break down when exposed to the heat of a grill, thyroid hormones maintain their shape. They easily survive the cooking process, and they also withstand the harsh, acidic environment of the human stomach. When the patient ate their evening meal, they were unwittingly swallowing highly concentrated doses of active, functioning hormone. The digestive tract absorbed this chemical directly into the bloodstream, where it circulated to every organ, pressing the metabolic accelerator pedal to the floor. Once the source was identified, the path to healing was simple and highly effective. The most vital intervention was simply to stop eating the contaminated food. Because the patient's own thyroid gland was perfectly healthy and had merely gone dormant to protect the body, there was no need for surgery or complex interventions. The body just needed time to clear the foreign substance. To protect the patient during this waiting period, doctors prescribed a common medication known as a beta blocker. This medicine acts like a chemical shield over the heart's receiving ports. It does not remove the excess hormone from the blood, but it safely blocks the hormone from attaching to the heart muscle, allowing the racing pulse to finally slow down to a quiet, restful rhythm. Over the following weeks, the patient's liver and kidneys steadily dismantled and filtered the bovine hormones out of circulation. As the chemical floodwaters gradually receded, the symptoms simply melted away. The persistent heat faded, the hands grew steady, and the deep, restorative sleep that had been missing for so long returned. Once the blood was completely clear of the external hormone, the brain sensed the quiet and gently signaled the patient's own native thyroid gland to wake up and resume its careful, balanced work. This unusual event illustrates a fundamental truth about how medical diagnosis actually works in practice. A physician must often look beyond the physical boundaries of the patient's own skin, recognizing that the human body is always in continuous, invisible conversation with the outside world. Solving a complex medical mystery frequently requires stepping away from the microscope and the laboratory to examine the most ordinary, overlooked details of a person's daily life. That's the last case, nothing more to follow. Good night.